So when you say that you've met with these folks, did they bring this significant problem to your attention earlier this past year in the fall when my towns were first notified? Did they bring it to your attention?
We started talking about I'm trying to remember how many, some months ago, I think it was perhaps last summer when we first started having these discussions. One thing that I might add is that for quite some, actually generally or routinely, there's conversation about congregate meal sites, how many, where they are, some perform at a higher level than others, and as funding has over time, quite a few years, become somewhat more of an issue, congregate sites have been adjusted. A site that maybe only had 4 or 5 people attending would be combined with another site that, that type of thing. And so those discussions have always been ongoing.
But what I'm really getting at is, did they raise the concern flag to you, to your office, in a reasonable amount of time? Because as a legislator, when I have 2 weeks' notice that my senior centers are going to lose half of their meal allocations, it is extremely alarming to me. And so I'm trying to understand where the communication breakdown happened, because as legislators, if we're not notified just a few months ahead of time, I just don't understand how these kinds of issues can happen. So you were aware that this was a significant issue last fall?
Yes, we knew that there were issues, and there had been for a couple of months discussion about this, but they had been perhaps worked out through the management from the area agencies on aging. I should add one other thing, though, and that is that there's a procurement process. You can see all of this through the websites very easily to contract for these meals, and it's done in 3-year periods. And this was the beginning of a new 3-year period. And when that happens, those agencies go through, each one of them does a procurement process to acquire bids to provide meals for the period of time. And that started this past October. And that really was a trigger, because it was the increased pressure then obviously became apparent with the new contracting period. And that was perhaps, what should I call it, something of a trigger point for an evaluation of how this is done.
Okay. So I just have a couple more questions, and I know my
Sure.
colleagues have others. So in doing some additional homework, I realized that you have right now presently in your budget, under programs for senior citizens, $1.4 million available, roughly $1,462,000 and $376 available within your line item called Programs for Senior Citizens.
Mm-hmm.
And is there any ability at all for your agency to do an FAC transfer of any kind to be able to backfill and meet the needs of our seniors and making sure that they get 5 meals a day?
We talked about this, I know, last week, and I very much appreciate certainly your willingness to have these discussions, I should say that. So those programs are all under contract and allocated through, there's an allocation there that you see, and committed for the fiscal year. And I know I left our conversation thinking I'll go back and check again, which I have, and am not at this point in time aware of any additional funding that we have that we could use without terminating another program. Now, obviously, that's a difficult situation too, because, for example, one program we often discuss here, the Alzheimer's Respite Program, these are programs that the need for has also been long established. And so that, I think, is the difficult position that we all find ourselves in.
So if you could bring to the subcommittee exactly what programs are listed in SIDS under Programs for Senior Citizens, so that I understand, because when I'm looking at your budget, there's literally like 5 or 6 line items, and that's it. But then when I look at your agency submittals that you brought to OPM looks like it was in September, your packet is very thick compared to what your budget is, because you're putting in potential legislation, written potential language changes in statute. And so I'd just like to have a little bit more detail if I could. You're looking at me
I might
like-
ask for some clarification about exactly what you mean by that question.
So when I look at this is the packet of information that you've sent to OPM. There's only 2 pages of a budget, but there's a lot of potential legislation on behalf of your agency. And so what I mean by that is, for somebody who has such a small amount of line items, your packet's pretty thick. And so if I could have a better explanation of what those line items mean,
Certainly.
that would be so helpful. And
Certainly.
I do appreciate the situation you're in. What I am very proud of, though, is that my district has stepped up. And we have donations being collected. We have small businesses who are making meals. We have people who really care. But we need to know that these services are needed behind this table. Because if I had any idea that the need was growing like that and the money wasn't being allocated to meet that need, I would have done something 6 months ago. So I appreciate the open line of communication. I hope we can talk about it further. Thank you, Madam Chair.